Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and Philip Jaisohn Memorial Foundation CLE, Violence, Division, and Action, Perspectives on the Asian American Experience. We are honored to have with us today from the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas, the Honorable Stella Tsai, George Choe, President and CEO of the Philip Jaisohn Memorial Foundation, Lucy Q of the Senior Law Center and Montgomery Bar Association, co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, Jimmy Chong, and special guest, Nydia Han from 6ABC Action News. Today's topic is the next chapter in the DEI Committee's We Need to Talk series. The series has opened the dialogue on topical issues addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion. The dialogue has been informative, enlightening, and at times emotional. It has also been essential to the Montgomery Bar Association's commitment to address inequality, prejudice, bias, and ignorance. I know that you will find today's presentation informative, and I hope that it brings you a better understanding of these important issues that are addressed today. A special thank you to our affinity partner, USI, for sponsoring today's program. I will now turn the program over to our moderator, the ever competent Nancy Walsh.
Thank you, Jackie, and welcome everyone. My name is Nancy Walsh. For those of you who don't know, I am privileged to work with the Montgomery Bar Association as a consultant, and my particular heart and passion working with everyone here is through the development of leadership programs and initiatives focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you everyone for being here today. I'm going to start off with just a few logistical details so that everybody knows what has to happen and we can really dig into the meat of these rich conversations. So in order to comply with the Pennsylvania CLE board, we need to make sure that you're all paying attention. So anyone who is here seeking CLE credit, you need to listen for 3 words, one at a time, that will be shared, interspersed throughout the event, and you'll have to remember them, so write them down. And then you will be asked to enter them in the brief survey that will show up at the end of your screen at the end of the presentation. So make sure you're paying attention. I will make sure I don't interrupt too often. And you will also have a quick 15 to 20 second survey that's going to show up on your screen about halfway through the program as well. So be on alert for that. A quick overview of the format for the day. I have the great honor of introducing our esteemed panelists and asking them each a question or two. Throughout the conversation, please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. If you have questions for our first panelist, the esteemed Nydia Han, please submit them throughout her presentation, as she's going to have to leave us a little bit prior to the end of the program. We'll save some time at the end of the program after all of the panelists have spoken for general Q&A, and you can share those questions then. We have a jam-packed presentation, so I, for once, am going to keep my comments brief, and we'll get started. Our first panelist is ABC's consumer investigative reporter, troubleshooter, and co-anchor of Action News Sunday Morning. She is also the creator of the documentary series, This is America, a provocative, fresh look at who we are as Americans, and in my humble opinion, a must-see for all of us here today. She is an Emmy Award-winning journalist dedicated to exposing scams, protecting consumers, and encouraging businesses to do the right thing. In her work related to This is America, she hopes to inspire all of us to get to know each other's unique American stories, check our own biases, and act as positive agents of change and unity in our communities. Without further ado, I am pleased to present Ms. Nydia Han.
Nancy, thank you so much. And thank you to the Montgomery Bar Association for hosting this. I'm really tremendously honored and grateful that you are creating this safe space to have this conversation and to address the issues confronting our community right now. We really are a community in crisis. To put it into perspective for you, since the pandemic began, 3,800 anti-Asian hate incidents have been recorded across the country. And a recent study shows a surge in anti-Asian hate crimes reported to police nationwide, nearly a 150% increase across major cities since the pandemic began, a spike of nearly 200% in Philadelphia. And all this because Asian Americans are being erroneously blamed for the coronavirus because it was first detected in Wuhan, China. And a lot of Asian Americans in particular saw this coming. I mean, I started warning about this scapegoating at the end of February 2020, basically calling on people not to blame us and to understand that the coronavirus impacts all races, all religions, and that no one is immune. And that in fact, only if we come together can we fight this disease. And even for those of us who have not been physically assaulted, this is having a profound and traumatizing impact. I am personally just sick over it and heartbroken over it. I remind my father every day not to take walks by himself because I worry especially about him because it is so many elderly Asian Americans who have been the victims of these unprovoked attacks. There was a 84-year-old grandfather in San Francisco who died as a result. And, this again is happening not just in our region, but across the country. And it seems every day one of my fellow journalists is reporting yet another unprovoked attack. I mean, these are innocent people being slapped, punched, set on fire, spit on, and again, even killed. But there are two things that I want to talk about today. Number one, this is not just about Asian Americans. This virus of hate moves. So today we're talking about the Asian American community, but tomorrow it will be somebody else. And second, this hate did not just suddenly erupt. I mean, it is deeply rooted in anti-Asian sentiments that have impacted our community throughout our history. So I'd like to play a 5-minute video that kind of gives you an overview of what's happening today and some insight into where this hate stems from, how generations of discrimination and stereotyping have contributed to the current situation. So if I can ask you to play that video, Megan, that'd be great.
He just hit me right in the face and he knocked me pretty much unconscious.
What can we do to protect our people? What can we do to protect each other?
The Asian American community is desperately seeking answers as the onslaught of hate incidents continues. In Philadelphia on Easter Sunday, a 27-year-old Korean American woman smacked in the face. 2 days later, a 64-year-old Chinese American father was assaulted just blocks away in Chinatown.
The suspect yelled, "You gave me coronavirus," and proceeded to attack the victim.
Vietnamese American Kylam Nguyen suffered a similar attack in a Philadelphia suburb more than a year ago.
What exactly did this person say to you?
He told me, "Coronavirus, get the out of here."
He called you the coronavirus?
Yes.
The Department of Justice has now pledged to tackle the problem. So has President Joe Biden.
It's wrong, it's un-American, and it must stop.
But many say it will take time to repair the damage caused by the previous administration's anti-Asian rhetoric.
The Wuhan virus,
it comes from China.
Kung flu.
It's been a sustained campaign for over a solid year now, and we're seeing the effects of it.
But this hate didn't just erupt. To understand what is happening today, you have to understand our past.
Racism against Asian Americans is not only alive and well, it has a long and painful history.
Absolutely. One of the main reasons is that Asians are considered foreign.
I spoke out about this in a viral Facebook video after a driver yelled at me, "This is America."
I am American, born and raised.
Asian American Studies professor Josephine Park says the forever foreigner stereotype is not only hurtful, it has led to racist U.S. laws.
The first group of people excluded from entry to the U.S. were Asians.
The Page Act of 1875 was the first U.S. law to restrict immigration. It effectively banned entry by so-called lewd and immoral Chinese women. The Chinese Exclusion Act later prohibited all Chinese immigration. And these laws were just the first of many policies born out of the false perception that Asians pose a threat to our nation's economy, health, and safety.
It's a part of the kind of deeply inhuman characterization of Asians. They're considered alien.
Many states made it illegal for Asians to own or lease land. At the turn of the 20th century, before COVID-19, some health officials blamed the Chinese for a different disease, the bubonic plague. And under Executive Order 9066, more than 120,000, mostly Americans of Japanese descent, were imprisoned during World War II.
There was barbed wire there, and you couldn't go out. They lost everything. They lost their businesses. By the time they came back, everything was gone.
Decades later, the U.S. government apologized, admitted to race prejudice and a failure of political leadership. But Asian Americans are still blamed for events overseas.
Often this characterization of Asians as the enemy. And when you get that kind of enemy characterization, all kinds of violence suddenly becomes possible.
This is the 150th anniversary of the largest recorded mass lynching of Chinese, which was in 1871. In October of 1871, 17 Chinese were lynched in Los Angeles, Chinatown.
More than 100 years later, Patrick Purdy shot and killed 5 Southeast Asian school children.
It turned out that he was blaming Southeast Asians for taking jobs away from white people.
In 1982, Vincent Chin was bludgeoned to death.
They accused him of being responsible for their unemployment, the unemployment of Detroit auto workers.
Scapegoating Chin for Japanese cars in the American marketplace.
You know, he's Chinese American, but those distinctions didn't matter. And so it was very revealing how Asians could be lumped together.
2 men pleaded guilty for Chin's murder, but served no jail time.
This has been a pattern that, if you committed violence against Chinese or Asians, that there would be no consequences.
Experts attribute this in part to the model minority myth.
That anti-Asian attacks get discounted and they won't be called out as racism, in large part because there's this perception of Asians' privileged social and economic position.
The term emerged to describe Asian Americans as a group that's achieved success despite marginalization. It's used to make unfair comparisons, pitting Asian Americans against Blacks and Latinos.
It's really at the fault of white supremacy. It puts other communities of color against each other.
The reality is Asian Americans have the widest income gap and some of the highest rates of poverty. But as more people shine light on these issues, many are optimistic the Asian American narrative can finally change.
There's so many examples actually of cross-racial alliance right now around this crisis, so there are signs of hope.
Thank you for playing that. And indeed, there are signs of hope. I mean, I think the silver lining for this is that we are seeing so many activists, particularly Asian American activists. We're also seeing a lot of solidarity among all communities of color. So I think if we can kind of take this opportunity to really listen to each other and help each other, we can actually get somewhere. So there is that silver lining there. Thanks for playing that video.
Thank you, Nydia, for leading us back to a sense of hope, because that was tough to watch. As you noted, many mistakenly believe that this is new news. But you wrote that op-ed to which you referred in the Philadelphia Inquirer before the official pandemic shutdown even began. Can you tell us what compelled you to write that piece and maybe share some reflections of what those thoughts are a year later and where we are now?
Yeah, so I was hearing stories from friends and colleagues and just people in the community about how they were suddenly being treated. They were being looked at suspiciously if they coughed in public. Children were being told to wear masks when others were not being told to do that. And I mean Asian American children. And I found these stories really heartbreaking, and I could see what was coming. We knew that, at the end of February, that this was just the beginning of what was likely to be a pandemic. And so I had some community leaders who asked me if I would speak out on this issue. And so I first posted on Facebook, and then the Philadelphia Inquirer saw my Facebook post and asked me to write an op-ed about it. And my op-ed starts out by saying, my dad does not have the coronavirus and neither do I. So please don't treat us like we do. And it was basically a call for people to, again, understand the science of the disease and not to blame or scapegoat our community, and just to treat us with respect and kindness as we all try to do with each other. And unfortunately, as I think is often the case when Asian Americans speak, the rest of America did not listen. And so here we are. And it's really disturbing to me that more than a year later, we're having the same conversation and fighting the same fight. And frankly, things have gotten worse. So, that piece that I produced where I talk about that attack on Easter Sunday, I was sitting outside with my family. We were celebrating Easter Sunday, our son's 7th birthday, when suddenly my phone started vibrating nonstop. And before I even looked at my phone, I knew what it was. I knew it was another unprovoked attack on an Asian American. And when I looked at my phone, indeed, that's what it was. It was videos and text messages from people wanting me to, warn the community about what had happened. A 27-year-old Korean American woman was just randomly slapped in the face as she was walking to the H&M near the convention center. I actually just talked to her in person, did an on-camera interview with her yesterday for a piece that's going to air in May. Because I think the other thing to remember here is we have to really understand the victim stories and understand that this is not a one and done issue. She did not leave her house again for 2 weeks after that happened. She just started going back to work, and she's clearly still really shaken up by this. She said that it'll be a long time before she voluntarily returns to Center City. She has a court date, so she'll have to return for that reason because the suspect was arrested. But my other concern is that as long as we are seen as the enemy, as long as we're seen as the forever foreigner, these kinds of attacks will continue, and we will continue to get blamed for things that happen overseas. And so, one of the things, I'm actually writing another piece right now for the Philadelphia Inquirer. It's going to publish on Sunday. And one of the things I say is, this is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. But this month will come to an end. And, eventually the coronavirus pandemic will also come to an end. But I hope that even after sort of the news cycle and the attention that our community is getting now ends, I hope that these issues will continue to be talked about and addressed and confronted, because I think that we really need to change the narrative for Asian Americans once and for all. You're muted, Nancy.
Yes, I apologize. We knew that was going to happen. Thank you for sharing those stories and for putting faces and names to an issue that just seems so broad to some people. I personally believe deeply that the only way we're ever going to eradicate such ignorance and hatred and that sense of otherness is to make it personal, and to see these acts not as generalities, but as pain inflicted on people we know and respect and care about. So would you mind, can you share some personal experiences of race-related incidents and talk to us about how they affected you?
Sure. I mean, just one morning in February, I woke up, and as I always do, I immediately looked at my email, and I had an email where the subject line was "FU Nydia Han, Asian which," but replace the W with what was written in this email. And then the body of the email was just that one line again: "FU Nydia Han, Asian effing which," right? And so I'm sort of used to these kinds of attacks because with the nature of the work that I do, and especially now talking a lot about anti-Asian hate and racism, I get a lot of pushback. But I really worry about the kinds of responses that people who are not in my situation will have, especially if they're not used to this kind of treatment. And I think about what it was like when I was a kid. I mean, I was taunted for being Asian American, for having almond-shaped eyes, for having coarse hair. People asked me where I was from all the time. I would say that I was born and raised in the United States, and then they would say, but where are you really from, right? And so I would say Korea. My ancestors are from Korea, and they would say, what is Korea? It sounds like some sort of disease. Once when I was on the school bus, a student asked where I'd gotten my shoes, and I said, oh, I got them from Korea. And she said, oh, is that new store in the Galleria? And so, I mean, there's ignorance and then there's racism, but it all sort of feeds into our sense of our American self. And it really impacts the way we move through the world. And even, as a news journalist and someone on TV, when I was a reporter in Pocatello, Idaho, a couple came up and asked if I was lost and if I speak English. And those things really are cutting. It's like death by 1,000 paper cuts. Like I always say that, again, I haven't been physically assaulted, but I feel like all of these incidents are physically traumatizing for me too. And I think a lot too about, even as a working journalist, like there were times where I used to lighten my hair because I wanted to look and seem more white. I would ration the number of stories related to the Asian American community that I would pitch because I didn't want to sort of overemphasize my Asian-ness. And, as a child, I would say to my mom tells the story when I was little. One day I came home and she said, that I said, when am I going to turn blonde and have long legs like everyone else? And, I want for my children a very different experience, and I want them to be proud and to lean into who they are and their Korean American identity. And, I am able to do that now after 47 years, right? But I hope that I'm giving them the gift of the ability to do that much earlier on. And I think that what's happening now, this kind of backlash against our community, will have an impact even on our very young people. And that's why I continue to speak about it and talk about it, because I know on a very personal level how this affects us.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And with work like you're doing and hopefully discussions like today, your kids won't have to feel the way you felt and the way so many others do. It just struck me that you said, well, I'm used to that by now. Nobody should be used to that by now. And we need to stop being okay with people getting used to it. Anti-Asian acts are sadly just one component of the racism infecting our society, as you spoke of earlier. In your recent 6ABC town hall on anti-Asian hate, you touched on the intersectionality of racism against Black and Asian communities. Can you share your thoughts on that reporting and what we can do to kind of combat that?
Yeah, and there are a lot of common threads, I think, in our experiences, but I think it's really important not to compare and contrast the struggles of our communities. I mean, they are very different, and I think we need to understand and acknowledge that many things can be true at once. And racism is not a zero-sum game, and we have to stop grading racism, and we have to understand that also there's a long history of Black-Asian solidarity, and when we do work together, we can actually advance our shared goals. I always say, I don't use the hashtag Asian Lives Matter because I think that it unnecessarily co-opts the Black Lives Matter movement. So I like to say you can be for hashtag Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate because this is America. I think a lot of people don't know about our history at a time when, the Chinese Exclusion Act was becoming an issue. Frederick Douglass spoke out in 1869 in favor of the entry of Asians to this country. And later, Black Americans were concerned about the Emergency Detention Act. And that was repealed only after Japanese Americans locked arms with Black activists. And today, you could see in that video that we showed the sign saying Black Asian solidarity. I mean, Black and Asian activists are very much speaking for each other and standing with each other. I mean, I always say we have to stand on each other's shoulders so that together we can see over this wall of racism. On May 12th, I'm going to participate in a Philadelphia unity rally against gun violence and against anti-Asian hate. And this is for the sake of really public safety. This is for all of us. I mean, that's the other thing that I kept trying to hammer home in that first op-ed, which is, it is human nature to, when you're afraid, to then automatically default to hate and prejudice. I mean, Jews were blamed for Black Death. The Irish were blamed for cholera. African Americans were blamed for Ebola when that was happening in Africa. I mean, this is not new. It's not really unique to our community right now, what's happening right now. And so I think that it's important that we all realize that and realize this is not just about Asian Americans. This is not just about people of color. It is truly about all of us. Racism has now been declared a public health crisis, and I think that's very much what it is. The thing that I really worry about too is the model minority myth. And as you saw in that video, it is so critical that we dismantle that, because it does pit the Asian American community against the Black and Latino communities, and it is just unconstructive. And I will say that there was a time when I think a lot of Asian Americans actually just kind of went along with the model minority myth because it didn't seem damaging or destructive to just be considered, for all of us to be considered smart and hardworking. But I think we're seeing now that there is a problem with the model minority myth and how it does negatively impact not only people in the Asian American community, but people in every community. So I think we're all learning a lot. And I think as we have these conversations and educate ourselves and each other, I think that's all positive and it's all progress. But I think it is important when we're talking about anti-Asian hate to also remember and talk about how hate affects all groups.
Perfectly said. Thank you. And I think this is a perfect time for me to throw in our first little magic CLE word, because that word is solidarity. So please don't have a hard time remembering that one, everyone. Write that down and put it in your hearts, and you'll have a chance to add that to your survey at the end. I would encourage everyone from the audience, if you have some questions, we will have a few minutes. I have one more question for Nydia, and then I can take some questions from the audience before she sadly has to leave us. So send them in the chat now. We've done a lot of talking and a lot of listening in this past year, and certainly that is the first step towards change. But obviously the next step, the crucial step, is action. Can you maybe share some ideas for actionable steps we can take to help and to be allies in this work?
I think there are a lot of things people can do. And I really hope when people think about supporting our community, it's not just one and done acts. So yes, I would love to see people join us at that Philadelphia Unity rally. But what I really would like to see is people not just, posting on social media or attending an event, but really persistently noticing and calling out bad behavior, including microaggressions and so-called jokes. For so long, Asian Americans too, we've just sort of kept our head down, ignored racism, but I think we all need to lift our heads and lift each other up. And when we hear somebody saying something that is inappropriate or cutting or perpetuating a stereotype, I think the responsibility lies on all of us to say, you know what? That's racism, and that is not okay. And, in the reporting that I've done, I've seen what happens when we do that. So for instance, there was a place called Lenny's Hoagie Shop. It's a place in Philadelphia, and it posted a racist menu item. It called macaroni and cheese covered in Chinese chili garlic sauce, COVID Mac. Well, when Asian American journalists, including myself, amplified that issue, the menu item was taken down. When a board member for a very important Philadelphia labor union posted an anti-Asian racist meme on social media, again, my fellow Asian American journalists and I amplified that issue. The board member resigned. SAG-AFTRA, which is the labor union, put out a very powerful statement, more powerful statement than they had prior. And then he ended up resigning. So he has now been replaced with a Chinese American actor named Lyman Chen in Delaware. But I think even in classrooms or in courtrooms or in negotiations or, wherever you find yourself, I think it's really important, even when it might seem small. I know that it's not small to the recipient of whatever the hateful word is or the joke is. I can't tell you how many times I've been called Connie Chung, or just the other day when I was at the Acme, there was a group of kids in a car, and when they saw me coming, they started saying ching chong, and just those kinds of things have been strangely permissible against our community. And I think it's really important that everyone, especially non-Asian Americans, stand up and say, this is not okay. And I also think, people need to be informed. I encourage people to learn about our history, because it's only when you understand our experience and what has happened before that you can then really and meaningfully take action and do something and support us. And there are lots of ways to do that. 6ABC we've done a number of programs about the Asian American community. We're planning more for May. I have a website, NydiaHan.com. You can follow me and a lot of other people on social media because we're constantly talking about these issues. And then also I've been really heartened with stories that I've seen across the country of people volunteering to walk with Asian American seniors or Asian American kids who feel vulnerable. There was a story that I read out of California where neighbors were guarding an Asian American home because it had been the target of threats and harassment. And so I think people can also take the initiative, help people report an incident. The numbers that I gave before probably just scratch the surface. We know that hate incidents against Asian Americans are often unreported. There's often a language barrier. 1 in 7 Asians in this country is an undocumented immigrant. So there's fear. Sometimes there's a mistrust of police. So there are a lot of there are a lot of reasons why sometimes these incidents don't even go reported. And so I think it's important to help someone report an incident if you know about it. We see all of these Black Lives Matter signs. You can print out a free Stop Asian Hate sign and put it in your window to show solidarity. And then I say just use your pocketbook. Before things were shut down, Chinatown businesses, for instance, were already suffering because people were afraid to go to Chinatown. So you can support an Asian American business, watch a movie, Minari, that's been made by an Asian American filmmaker or tells our stories. And then the other thing is you could donate to a nonprofit group that's working to stop the hate or working to help one of the victims. So there are lots of, I think, very concrete things that people can do every day to really help us.
Those are such great ideas. Like you said, very concrete and kind of all just leading from kindness and empathy. That's going to tell us how to do this, and your examples hit that spot on. So I have some great questions from the audience. One attendee asks, as a mother, what, if anything, do you say or teach your children about the racism that surrounds the Asian American community? Similarly, what, if anything, do you recommend other parents say to their children or teach their children about these issues?
So I don't want them to be surprised if someone says something hurtful to them. So I have warned them that there are some people who are blaming Asian Americans for the coronavirus, so that they should be aware of that, but also understand that it is not, in fact, our fault. So that's the one thing that I've sort of said to them and told them during the pandemic. But what I try to do every day and all the time is just to model my behavior and show them how proud I am to be an Asian American and a Korean American, so that I instill that pride in them. I mean, they are very well aware that, in my view, to be American, we really have to embrace and acknowledge the gifts of our ancestors. And so, they go to Korean school every Saturday to learn the language and to learn our traditions. And at home, we follow a lot of the traditions from Korean culture. And so, we're always making mandu, which are Korean dumplings, with my dad. And on, New Year, we always do seodae, which is big bow. And I know that these things are making a difference, because, when our daughter was in first grade, she had to draw pictures that would explain who she is. And one of the things that she drew was a Korean flag. And then another thing that she drew dumplings. And this made me so happy and so proud. And so I think for me, because my kids are so young, our son just turned 7 and our daughter is turning 9 this Thursday. And so they're pretty young. And so for me, I think I don't tell them a lot. I don't share with them the attacks that I cover or that my colleagues are covering. I don't really want them to feel fearful in that way. And I think for their age, in my opinion, it's just a little too much information. And so I think that my job right now at their age is just to show them how proud I am. And it's certainly, it's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is the month of May. And so there will be so many opportunities to do that even outside of our home, that I like to make sure that inside our home, that's just a way of life for us.
Oh, that is so great. I'm sure you could all see how Nydia's face literally lit up talking about those examples. And, it's just so nice to turn this into positivity and the really positive celebratory ways we can make a difference. And I've always believed that if we lead the way and act the way we would want to treat our kids or our parents, everything else is going to fall in place. So Nydia's story is a perfect example of that.
And I think the biggest message really for all of us, and what I also try to tell our children in an effort to combat this hate and to combat racism, is really the importance of moving in, getting outside of our bubbles and understanding the experiences that are different from our own. And I mean, I learned that myself when I had that "This is America" journey. A driver yelled "This is America" at me on a Philadelphia street almost 4 years ago now. And I responded to her on Facebook. That ended up going viral. And then we turned, like 3 million people watched it, tens of thousands of people commented on it. And I just couldn't leave that conversation there. And so I basically turned the comments into a docuseries where I talk to people, many of whom had a different view than I do, to see, why do we feel the way we do about race and racism, and who is an American? And I realized that first of all, I had my own biases that I needed to contend with. And secondly, when we actually sat down and had a conversation and figured out all the things that we had in common, we then had a chance to actually dialogue about all of our differences. And the conversations that we ended up having were truly illuminating. I talked to this guy named Wayne, who really fueled the flames on Facebook over my video. And in my mind, he was racist, and I thought that he was uneducated and unsophisticated and all of these things. And then when I met him, it turns out, we have a lot of things in common. We both love basketball. We have the same hopes and dreams for our kids who are about the same ages. And, he basically told me that he had responded to my video out of this knee-jerk reaction of fear and anger. I mean, at the time, this country, remains politically divided, but it was sort of at its height. And he felt like when people saw him, they automatically, because he's white, thought that he was in a certain category and racist and all these other things. And so, I think that the best thing that we can do is really just talk to each other and take a moment and pause and try to understand each other's experiences.
That's great. Thank you. I'm thinking I would love to come and make dumplings with you and your daughter, and you can come and make pierogies with me in honor of my mother and her heritage. And if we could all do something similar, I think we're on to something.
That sounds great to me.
All right, it's a date. I have one more question for you. One member asks, is this mainly a problem that we see in the city and a lesser problem in the suburbs? Or is it, pervasive? And I think we know the answer to that, sadly.
Yeah, unfortunately not. I mean, again, so when I was, so I think it was in March, it might have been later in the spring, but I was getting story after story after story from all over our community, suburbs and the city. I remember someone sent me a picture and video of her neighbor. I'm trying to think what community this was, but it might have been Chester County or Bucks County. Anyway. She sent me a picture and video of her neighbor putting up a sign that said "F you, China." And it had lights strung around it so that even at night, it sort of lit up the night sky with this hateful message. There have been a number of school districts and people within school districts who have come to me with concerns about things that have been said to them in the classroom, sometimes even by teachers and administrators. So this feeling and this anti-Asian sentiment is certainly not unique to the city. A lot of the physical attacks that we've covered have been in the city. A couple of them have actually been in Chinatown. But certainly, this is not unique to the city at all.
Unfortunately. Thank you. And thank you for your continued work, your continued sharing of stories, and for being with us today. I'm going to move on and introduce our next panelist. But I think it's a good time for me to throw in that our second magic word, and in honor of Nydia's tradition, I am going to make that word dumpling. So write that one down.
Thank you for having me, everybody.
Thank you so much for being with us. You were wonderful. Our next panelist, the Honorable Stella Tsai, was appointed to the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas in 2016 and then elected to the bench in November 2017. Before joining the bench, Judge Tsai was a business litigation partner in the Philadelphia office of Archer and Greener, concentrating in regulatory compliance, land use, and ethics. She re-entered private practice after serving as chair of administrative law at the City of Philadelphia Law Department from 2000 to 2003, where she managed the attorneys who represent the child welfare and social service agencies. Throughout her career in private practice, Judge Tsai remained actively involved in charitable activities and public service. While in private practice, Judge Tsai provided countless hours of pro bono representation and advocacy for low-income individuals in a wide range of manners, including custody and support disputes, voting rights cases, civil rights cases, political asylum, and other immigration issues. A fun little side note here. Judge Tsai also happened to be a superstar young associate at the same firm I worked at many years ago. And while preparing for today's presentation, we had the opportunity to connect after more than 25 years of not seeing each other. So welcome, Judge Tsai.
Thank you. You haven't changed.
Oh, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I'm going to stick with who I am. Nor have you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Ahead.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to extend my gratitude to the Montgomery Bar Association, County Bar Association, for having this conversation, because it's really critical that we do. Just by way of background, as you indicate, I am now judge of the Court of Common Pleas. I am the third of 3 state court judges of Asian American descent in the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So although my election to the bench represents some progress, we still have a lot of work to do. And as reflect on our history and heritage as Asian Americans in the legal profession. And I suppose I'm just going to go ahead and
jump right in.
Go for it. Okay, jump for it.
Go for it.
The narrative gets really complicated because I have so much to say after hearing Nydia. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what it's like to be an Asian American legal profession as both a lawyer and a judge. But so as Asian Americans, and as Nydia indicated before, we are certainly well aware of our mythological status as a so-called model minority, but simply because of the way we look, even when our ancestors may have come to the United States decades ago, we are branded consciously or subconsciously as foreigners. I generally have faced relatively benign incidents in the realm of racial profiling, like getting ni-how'd or ching-chonged, as Nydia said, or asked how long I've been here. And that is always quite fun when they're in the middle of a hearing in front of a state legislator who asked me how long I've been here. It's like, well, since I was born in Harrisburg, 1963, But the recent random attacks indicate that things are getting worse or even life-threatening. And some of the recent events have been documented in a survey that I believe will be circulated to the participants that was taken by PCDC, the Philadelphia Chinatown Development Corporation, just about the number of rising incidents of anti-Asian violence. Well, we just don't know what we are going to face or where an attack might come from when we leave our houses, leave our doors, leave the bubbles of the courtroom. So just as lawyers and judges, our competency as advocates and English fluency are not rebuttable presumptions, but rather they're things that have to be proven 24/7. So too must our right to live and work in the United States. We have to substantiate that time and time again. But why do I even care so much about what other people think? Well, part of the answer, I think, lies in my family history, and I'm sure the family history of a lot of other Asian Americans. I'm the child of immigrants who came to the United States from Taiwan, in the words of my mother, to be free. Although Taiwan may have been classified as an ally in recent years, it might surprise some of you to know that Taiwan started as a totalitarian regime that did not lift martial law until the 1990s. And some of you who are my friends who are on the call have heard the story before, but I have to tell others that my mother had an older brother named Tetsu, who was incarcerated by the nationalist regime for violating the law of sedition. For his crime of political resistance, my Uncle Ted was locked away for 15 years in a place called Green Island, and then another 3, simply because he refused to name names. And then when I tell the story before, I really have omitted a certain part from the narrative, which I think is important for us to understand. And that is, there's an absence of any meaningful judicial review of the political charges against him. There's no one for a political prisoner to appeal to. And he was one of the lucky ones who was not executed. You might imagine that when my parents had the opportunity to come to the United States in the early 1960s, they were quite eager to do so. And my mother got a chance to sponsor her brother Ted as an immigrant who too became a citizen of the United States. And believe me, he cherished every moment he had as a free man. These are some of the reasons I get so choked up when I listen to the national anthem. And I'm just so proud to be an American, so proud of our democracy, and proud to be a judge. And we stand on the shoulders of many Americans who have died or been hurt or sacrificed themselves so that we all may participate as equal citizens in our democracy, where people are bound together by the Constitution as amended and the rule of law, not by race or creed or any certain brand of religion. We need to resist and fight those forces which would have us go back in time when a whole class of individuals could be incarcerated or detained or just based on race, religion, in the name of national security, some other rubric, or rhetoric. This is why I, like many of you here, fight hard every day to protect voting rights, immigrant rights, and civil rights. When things get tough, though, it's helpful for me to remember the words of John Lewis and people like Judge William Maritani, the distinguished and courageous jurist who served at the Court of Common Pleas in Philadelphia after a brilliant career as a lawyer and advocate. He's a civil rights advocate. He was a second-generation teenager American studying pre-law at the University of Washington when World War II broke out. His family had to relocate to Tule Lake, thanks to the American government, to a camp where he was incarcerated for 6 months until the government let him go to attend college. As reported in a recent interview in 2000, the injustice was mind-boggling to Judge Maritani. He said, "My mind would not accept the fact that my country was doing this to me. To have your country against you, you wonder if something is wrong with you. I was insulted. The paranoia in this country was staggering." But instead of falling into despair, Judge Maritani joined the Army and later became part of the intelligence service in Japan. After several futile attempts to enlist with the Army, which prohibited the enlistment of Japanese Americans during World War II, he, like many incarcerated Japanese Americans who served in the US military during World War II, fought for the United States because they had an abiding faith in democracy and the ability of our country to overcome the damage caused by fear, paranoia, of prejudice, and racism. When Governor Milton Shapp appointed Judge Maritani to serve at the Court of Common Pleas, he became the first Asian American outside the Pacific Coast states to serve as a judge of general jurisdiction. In 1977, he was elected in his own right to serve a 10-year term. He had earned a sterling reputation as a jurist and certainly deserved election to the bench, but often joked about the fact that his name ended with a vowel, so it sounded Italian, and he could have earned him some votes. Times have changed. And in 2017, thanks to my predecessors like Judge Maritani, I was able to run openly as an Asian American, leverage my diversity. I did not have to campaign on the hope that my name, which also ends in a vowel, might be presented or presumed as Italian and win some votes. I could be me. It is truly humbling and an honor to put on a robe to defend, protect, and preserve the Constitution, uphold the rule of law, and ensure the fair administration of justice in service for all people, all Americans. This is what it's like to be an Asian American serving our country.
Well, it is not often that I am speechless, but I'm just going to let your words sit there. I have no response, but thank you. Thank you for sharing your story. Thank you for giving us a bit of perspective and the reminder that all of us need to look behind the person in front of us and know that there are stories there, know that there are uncles and aunts and parents and children and ourselves who have been hurt and who have, have a path that affects why we do what we do every day. So you're a lovely reminder of that. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to share that with you.
Thank you. I believe, hold on, someone just shared. I want to read this. Judge Tsai received the most votes of any candidate for any office in her general election, even more than Mayor Kennedy.
Thank
you, JR. See, Judge Tsai was worried that you would give some neighborly insights away and give her a hard time, but here you're being kind. So
Yes,
thank you, JR.
Very much appreciate that. Thank you. It did not hurt that I had the #1 ballot position, but we'll put that aside for now.
Oh, no, that had nothing to do with it. Well done. I wish I had time to ask each of you more than one question, but I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to talk. And then, of course, everyone send your questions in and we'll get to them after everyone's spoken. Our next guest is the remarkable George Choe. George joined the Philip Jaisohn Memorial Foundation as the president and CEO in 2018 after his long engineering and business career at a Fortune 300 international company, and has been focused in expanding its healthcare businesses with 2 Jaisohn Center operations in Philadelphia and Lansdale. George has a passion for young leadership development and promoting their participation in community service. His vision for the Jaisohn Center is to serve and lead the Asian American community in healthcare and human services to promote better access for those who are in need. He is also one of the founders of the Asian American Coalition, which has been providing COVID vaccinations and support throughout the community. I can also tell you that working with George is like a masterclass in efficiency, humility, impact, and leadership. George, referring back to our discussion earlier about converting talk to action, please tell us about the vision and work of the Philip Jaisohn Foundation and the Asian American community, as well as some recent efforts of other Asian American organizations in our community.
Thank you for this opportunity. To follow the Nydia Han and Judge Tsai, I am in the wrong place here. But we do have a couple organizations that I would like to share with this community about what we're doing. To talk about the Philip Jaisohn Memorial Foundation, I do need to talk about Dr. Philip Jaisohn, who is a local Korean Americans who lived in Delaware County until 1951. That's the year that he passed away. So this is not about the someone in Korea. It's about the person who lived around here and left his legacy. Dr. Jaisohn is the first Korean American to receive U.S. citizenship in 1890 and as a Korean American. And he's also first one to receive the U.S. educated medical doctor degree from now called George Washington Medical School in 1892. Then he went back to Korea for a little bit where he published the Korean language newspaper in Korea because he felt strongly that country should be governed by people, not by king. In order to do that, the people need to be able to learn about what's going on. And unfortunately, back then, Korean written communication was done in Chinese so that general public could not read it. And that's why he decided to publish a newspaper in Korean. So he is such a remarkable man, so that's why you can see why we're involved with the healthcare business in the greater Philadelphia area. And also because he spent rest of his life in the advocacy, not only the Korean independence, but the healthcares and also educating publics about what's going on in Asia, particularly in Korea for independence. And so for our organization, that's why we are involved with not only healthcare business, but also advocacy is one of the major mission for our organization. Now, what do we do during this pandemics? It's a difficult time for all of us, obviously. And we started what we call Happy Call program, where we had a conversations with about 3,000 seniors to check on their physical and mental health status, because it's been a long while, and the people have been, particularly our seniors, been cooked up in their place. And because they haven't been able to come out for physical exams, we also institute what we call visiting Jaisohn Health. So we go to seniors and take care of their physical needs. And of course, we also couldn't forget about our youth. And so we've been doing youth leadership programs. And Nancy Walsh, she was leading our summer leadership programs for our youth, and because it's important times, and we have to continue to work with them. And we also done the internship program in partnership with the Philadelphia Councilman David O's, and also we encourage our youth to continue to get involved with the community service. So we've done the President's Volunteer Service Award Program. Now, getting back to the Asian American Coalitions for Healthcare, our vision is to advance the Asian American community participations and also contributions. And we are encouraging us to get involved with the mainstream communities, and also influence the healthcare and human services through the community partnership. We have to connect with the peoples and and work together. And so we shouldn't put the walls around us. A lot of people misunderstand when we talk about Asian American Coalition that we are going to be just insulated as an Asian American, but that's not our purpose. And so one of the first top missions that we had at the beginning was to have an Asian American community needs assessment in the healthcare. Interesting enough, when for the first time about 15 healthcare network got together and they tried to develop a needs assessment, they forgot about Asian American community, and so that reinforced us that we need to unify our voice and then work on decision maker when that kind of events comes up. So what do we do in during the pandemics and with the COVID-19? We started the 8-language Asian American Coalition for COVID-19. And we first started with the virtual town hall meeting to educate not only our community, but also share our community issues with the decision makers in this region. And it was quite successful. And one of the data that was shared by county was that the Montgomery County vaccination site, when they look at the race data, that all the people who were vaccinated, only 0.7% of those folks were Asian Americans, and which just tells you there's an issue there. It's not because Montgomery County is not trying. I love Montgomery County leaderships because they are involved for all communities, and we work together really well. But fact is that in the public place like that, with on-stream online registration process, it's almost impossible for our community senior to be participating in that process. And that's why you were seeing that kind of a low rate. So which will tell us that we needed bilingual pharmacies or medical center like ours to get involved with the vaccinations. And so we, the other couple of things that really hit me at the beginning of this process was that the 88 years old Korean seniors called our staff and to trying to get a vaccination appointment. And unfortunately, at the beginnings, you know how it was in terms of a number of vaccines available. It was limited. So she was told that by our staff that okay, we got to put you in the waiting list. She was so desperate, and then she started crying, and so we had that kind of emotional incidents. And then the other things that at the early days, that when we had trial run for the Asian American Coalition to see how with all the language, 8 languages support that we needed to provide, how we're going to run that. And but when I saw number of seniors coming over to me and tell me that they're lucky to be vaccinated, and that to me is such a basic need, but they feel they need to be lucky to be vaccinated, and that really hit me. And so from then on, we start to really focus on community vaccinations, and so we done about 15 clinics so far, and with not only Asian American Coalition partner providing the 8 languages support, but also we didn't want to, like I say, insulate ourselves just for the Asian American community. So we had partnered with a couple African American church to go through this process together. And also we went to even mainstream Catholic parish. In fact, last weekend, Saturday, we vaccinated 525 people, but that particular parish included even Vietnamese, a lot of Vietnamese families. So we were able to vaccinate them together. And we also partner with Latino hairdresser associations, and also many local business, whether it's a grocery or restaurant, has a lot of Latino workers. And so we had to work with the association to so that their association owners are involved in this process, because Latino workers cannot come out of work during the working hours unless the owners are part of that process to support them. And so we were able to vaccinate them, whether it's in Lansdale office or Philadelphia office. And so we're also working with the Indo-Chinese American Council and the Philadelphia City Community Engagement and Partnerships. And now, as we're speaking, some of the political office, and we're working with them to vaccinate the community folks. So we are trying to, again, not just for Asian Americans, but all communities, and but what we, because of our support in the language and culture behind it, that our Asian American seniors and others who needs it are able to come. And with all these Asian hate going on, seniors are very reluctant to go to main large sites. I mean, that, in fact, one of our church member, who's not at all, but when he went to one of the largest sites, he said he felt very uncomfortable. So can you imagine that's how senior will feel to go to a place like that? And so we got to continue with this effort, and then we'll be working with mainstream organizations and the political office such a way that now we're going to focus on the people with the hesitancy, whether it's African Americans or Latinos, and even Asian American young professionals, and some of the young people are hesitant about this. And now, is there other organizations that are involved in supporting the mainstream? Yes, there are many Asian American community organizations ever since the pandemic started. If you look at the Chinese, Indians, and Korean community organization at the beginnings, when there's a much needed need for the PPEs, that when you look at some of the numbers that Chinese community organization provide to the mainstream healthcare or nursing home, it's enormous. It's like his number is not 1,000, it's 50,000, 100,000 masks. And they have done a enormous support for the mainstream communities. And we even donated PPE to Philadelphia sanitation workers because they were impacted disproportionately by this COVID. And so they were having even difficulty of a trash pickup because so many people were impacted by COVID. And I remember one morning that I got a call from Jimmy is saying, "Did you see that TV news?" I said, "No." And he was talking about the impact that it was having on Philadelphia sanitation workers. So I said, "Hey, we got to do some things." And so we went ahead and did that. And many Indians and Chinese organizations, Korean organizations, and also other Asian American organizations are also involved with the food deliveries. And so it's not just PPE, it's food deliveries. And interestingly enough, even our mother countries, governments, entities are involved in providing PPE for first responders in the local organization, whether it's the police and the healthcare workers. So there's a lot going on, and so there's a lot of positive things going on, and we can, as an Asian American, there's a lot that we can contribute. And by same tokens, we got to do these in partnerships with other organizations. I can talk about some. As an Asian American Coalition, we are also addressing what you've been hearing about hate against Asians, whether it's organizing the rally or community town hall. In fact, we had a plan to have a town hall meeting with the Josh Shapiro Attorney Generals, and we had to cancel it. But we will reschedule that soon. And but at the end, I think, again, Asian American, in the future, we should continue to work with other communities in partnership to deal with some of the issues that you're hearing today.
Thank you, George. I wasn't lying when I said George gets things done. That is just the tip of the iceberg of what he's got his hands in and is leading throughout the county. And his message, not to hearken back to a magic word at the beginning, hint, hint, solidarity, but he is certainly an example of solidarity at work. I'm going to take 1 second, well, 15 seconds to be exact, to allow Megan to put up the necessary CLE quick little survey. And if you can respond to that poll, if you need CLE credit, well, either way, you need to respond to it, and then we will move on. Okay. All right. I will also take a moment because before our last two wonderful speakers go on, to give you the last word, which is empathy. Okay. All right. Our next panelist, the MBA's own Lucy Q, currently works at the Senior Law Center as a staff attorney in its Norristown office and has been there since June 2020. There, she represents elderly victims of crimes in protection from abuse hearings, orphans court matters, landlord-tenant matters, and provides general legal advice and advocacy to senior citizens of Pennsylvania. Prior to this, she was an assistant district attorney at the Montgomery County DA's office for 5 years. I have the privilege of working with Lucy in the MBA's current Leadership Academy, where she is already standing out as a leader amongst leaders. Lucy, this time last year, members of the MBA were shocked and saddened as many African-American colleagues shared personal examples of bias and microaggressions they experienced right here practicing in Montgomery County. It was a crucial step towards creating change. Can you share what obstacles you faced as an Asian American lawyer in Montgomery County?
Sure, thank you, Nancy. I'm very honored to be a part of this panel. So I'll try to be quick here because we're ending on our time. So There's a few things that kind of came to my mind when I was preparing remarks for this. So one is representation. I think Montgomery County is a pretty diverse county for a suburb, but the Bar Association, and I don't mean the Bar Association itself, but the lawyer community, I guess, in Montgomery County is not that diverse. Being a prosecutor, I'm in the courtroom, my previous job, I was in the courtroom quite often. And, more times than not, I was probably the only Asian American in the courtroom, many times the only person of color in the courtroom. And I say that representation is important because, being a lawyer can be an isolating and stressful job, regardless of race and gender. But sometimes when you're the only person who looks like you in the courtroom, it can be a little bit harder. So it's nice knowing that, there's somebody else who maybe has a shared immigrant experience or shared background with you. So that's just one little pitch for, more diversity. If you want to try, people out there want to convince others to come practice in Montgomery County, because I actually find it to be a pretty welcoming community. And in terms of my, any obstacles I face as an Asian American, I don't think I've ever been discriminated against or been unfairly treated per se because of my, Asian American heritage. But as many of the panelists have kind of spoken to, I think a lot of us have been on the receiving end of many microaggressions, right? It's death by 1,000 cuts, so to speak. And, a few instances come to mind. And it's usually, a few instances come to mind. For example, I can think of one judge who's a senior judge, it's usually people of an older generation who, every time I would, it seemed like every time I would appear in front of him, either in the courtroom or even in chambers, he would always say, oh, I read this thing about this Chinese person. Have you seen that? Or, oh, I have a relative who, knows this Chinese person. And, I'm sure he had the best intent, right? Here's the problem. I'm sure he meant no offense. He did not mean to hurt me in any way. In fact, he probably had the best intentions, right? I think his intention was to try to engage with me on this level, try to find some kind of connection, right? But when that kind of stuff happens repeatedly, and it did with him, the message that I get is he sees me as, an Asian person, and that's maybe the only thing he sees me as, right? I think what anybody wants to be treated as is, a three-dimensional person. Yes, I'm Asian. That is certainly a part of my identity, but I'm also so much more than that. So when you meet someone for their first time and they say, oh, where are you from? And they're not satisfied when you say, Philadelphia. What that does is it kind of internalizes, as we've been talking about, this feeling of being like an outsider and foreigner. So that, even though you're a prosecutor, even though you're a lawyer, even though you're a member of the community, that some people out there will always view you as a foreigner, right? See you as Asian before American. So that's what these kind of microaggressions do when there's a pattern, when you kind of internalize all of these things. And it has nothing to do with that person's intent. That person, that's why it doesn't matter what that intent was. Like, I'm sure the person had the best intentions, but the result is it makes the person on the receiving end feel like they're not more than their, the shape of their eyes. And these are hard conversations to have. I'm not here to say it's never okay to ask me, what my heritage is. It's never okay to mention something about another Asian American, right? But I think what's important to keep in mind is we all just want to be treated as a person that is, has many different facets to them. So when that's the first thing that comes out of your mouth, what I internalize is you view me as an outsider, whether that's intent or not. So these kind of microaggressions, I think, have experienced. And what I will say is that if you see, a colleague or being treated this way, I'm not saying that every instance of this needs to be reported or, a complaint needs to be made about, a judge or something. But I think it's, I think you can just ask your colleague if that was, how they felt about that, right? Be a good ally. You don't have to necessarily do anything about it beyond that. I mean, yes, if there's a pattern of this kind of behavior from a judge or from another person, yes, maybe you should make, complaint about it or, do something else about it. But these are also really hard situations to navigate because it's very nuanced. And I will say, I think in terms of what you can do, oftentimes it has to be from, coming from a person with more power, right? When you're like a young associate, when you're in front of a judge, you're not going to want to say anything bad about a judge. You're not going to want to say anything bad about a partner. So, it's really, if you're in a position of power and you see a pattern of this kind of behavior, then, take it upon yourself to make sure that, the person's okay. Take it upon yourself to maybe say something to the president judge, right? And I think these are tricky subjects because people don't want to say, well, he didn't mean to offend you. I don't want to get him in trouble. And that's all fair, but we're so worried about, about offending someone, or we're so worried about like getting someone in trouble. But sometimes it's just about starting conversation. Like, the offending person might not even know that what they're doing is, hurtful in any way. So a lot of times it's just being aware of these situations, a conversation, and quite frankly, being uncomfortable and listening. I've been on the receiving end of, uncomfortable positions where I've had to take a step back and think about like, why did I say those things? Did it come from a position of bias or whatnot? So a lot of this is about listening and being uncomfortable. So I'll leave it up to that. And I know it's not necessarily easy thing to do, but I'm glad we're having these conversations, and that's kind of where it starts.
Thank you, Lucy. That was perfect. You're right. It is about being willing to be uncomfortable. It's about having the conversations. And thank you for making the point, which I think is so often misunderstood in these conversations, that sometimes we have to examine more than our intent. A lot of people excuse themselves because they never meant any harm. But that's not enough. We need to go further, and you explained that beautifully. Before I turn to our last panelist, it seems that a few people had a hard time hearing my last word. I apologize. I will repeat it one more time. Empathy. Enough said there, right? Okay. So last, but certainly not least, it's my honor to introduce my dear friend and partner in crime, Jimmy Chong. Jimmy handles plaintiff personal injury and patent infringement cases in Pennsylvania and Delaware. He is co-chair of the DEI committee and a graduate of the Montgomery Bar Leadership Program. He is also too humble to let me include his countless accomplishments and service to the community, but most of you here today know that he lets his actions speak for themselves. Jimmy, although our focus today has been to educate each other on what is happening now, as students of history, we all certainly understand that often the best way to affect change is to learn from our past. Can you describe past legislation and proposed bills that affect the Asian American community today?
Yes, thank you, Nancy. So it's amazing to be here. So thank you, Nancy, and to speak after everyone. It's you guys are great speakers. So I hope I can deliver as strong of a message. What I really wanted to talk about is just some of the history that has taken place within America and Asian Americans. And I think that's a better way for us, all Americans, to kind of see how it's developed. So really, I wanted to start all the way back in the 1840s and the 1850s. And that's when Chinese immigration started coming to America, just, they were cheap labor to help build railroads for Western expansion. And then it then led to the gold rush out west, and Chinese started immigrating more, obviously for the riches of gold. Well, then the American government looked at this and said, hey, these Chinese foreigners are coming in, taking our gold. So what can we do? Well, we'll create a foreign miners tax. So these miners as foreigners were being taxed. Hostility was really created towards the Chinese. And then in 1854, a white Caucasian male named George W. Hall killed a Chinese man. Now, he was convicted of murder, based on 3 Chinese witnesses. This was appealed to the California Supreme Court, and that what the California Supreme Court found were that Chinese people, and this is a quote, are a race of people whom nature has marked as inferior and who are incapable of progress or intellectual development beyond a certain point. Obviously, then the court then reversed the conviction, and he went as a free man. So that's kind of just some of the sentiment around Chinese. And as you all probably heard or noticed, a lot of Asians get lumped into one. In 1882, I'm going to move forward to 1882, there's a Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed. And that was solely to curb Chinese immigrants into this country. So at that time in 1882, the US government said, no more Chinese immigrants, and Chinese residents here are ineligible for naturalization. And that act actually starts off saying, whereas in the opinion of the government of the United States, the coming of Chinese laborers to this country endangers the good order of certain localities. So this is another sense. Our government, the US government is saying that the Chinese immigrants are endangering our country. 10 years passes by, and then in 1892, the Geary Act was passed, where it again not only further states that Chinese immigrants are no longer allowed in America, but for any Chinese resident, you had to have a certificate of residence. Basically, at all times, you had to have a certificate to say, yes, you were here prior to 1892, so you're still allowed to be in this country. Now, for any Chinese resident that was stopped and did not have that certificate, they were automatically put into hard labor and then deported from this country. Now, this went to the US Supreme Court saying, look, this act is a violation of the due process clause because there was no due process to being thrown in jail and then deported. The US Supreme Court found that this was an act, the Congress had the right to provide a system of registration and identification of any class of aliens within the country and take all proper means to carry out that system. So again, this is just another example of the government, legislative government, and the judicial government stating Asians, Chinese are not US citizens and won't be accepted here. And then the Immigration Act of 1917 essentially banned all immigrants from Asian countries to coming into this country. So they're just examples of how it's developed with our government and how Asians are looked upon, or Americans from Asian descent. Now, in 1942, Executive Order 9066 was enacted by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And this authorized the military to exclude any or all persons from certain areas in the United States that were designated as military areas. Now, although this order did not specifically identify any race or any country, it was really designed to remove and incarcerate Japanese individuals or any Americans with Japanese descent. Now, as you know, through American history, that our government took Japanese, these are American citizens that were, many were born and raised in America, never had been to Japan, and threw them basically in jail. During this time period from 1942 to 1945, 120,000 Japanese Americans were held in these internment camps. And I know we're running out of time, so just to really fast forward, this law, basically Asian Americans were not allowed in America until 1965. So it really has been, 50 some years since Asian Americans were allowed into this country. So right now, this sentiment is still taking place today. This isn't something that is just going away. It didn't happen back in the 1940s. It's still taking place today. And it's taking place in different forms. And one of the ways is, I was listening to Congressman Andy Kim speak. He was born here in America. However, and he through his, he's a congressman, but he was part of the military and he had security clearances. However, he was not given any security clearances dealing with the Korean Peninsula. And essentially, that's the US government saying, look, Andy, you're not American enough for us to trust you with these top secret confidential information because your parents were from Korea. And that sentiment still carries on today. Just recently, in a local school district, there were text messages going out within students, and text messages were basically stating, effing stupid Asians shouldn't be in this country. Every Asian kid I see tomorrow in the hall gets a spear. I hate Asians. And this went around, this was brought up to the school district's attention, and they basically punted on it saying, look, you know, this happened, text messages were sent, we have no control over it. And they didn't even inform other students or other parents. So this is continuing to happen today. And some of the bills I wanted to bring up were HR 1843 from Grace Meng from New York. It's called the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. And that is a act where the will require the Attorney General to appoint an individual from the Department of Justice whose sole responsibility will be to review COVID-19 hate crimes. Also, it's going to establish an online reporting system in multiple languages. And this is going to actually provide actual, if it gets passed, an actual avenue for individuals, victims of hate crimes, to report it in their own native language. So there's I wanted to touch upon a few more of some bills, especially in Pennsylvania, but time has passed. But feel free, please, to reach out to me, contact me. This is something that I'm very happy to talk about. We can go from there. Sorry, I ran on a little bit.
No, Jimmy, thank you for being so flexible. I know we didn't give you much time. There was so much rich conversation. We didn't want to cut anybody off. Just very, very quickly, thank you all. I know we've run a few minutes over time, but if anybody from the audience has a quick question that they want to throw our way, we could take it briefly now. Certainly, I know everyone on the panel would be more than happy to take your questions offline. Feel free to communicate with them. I personally thank you all of you panelists for sharing your stories, for being vulnerable and warm and wise. Thank you, Megan, and everyone at the MBA for making this as seamless as possible. And thank you to all of you for spending time with us today. This is not easy work. These are not easy conversations. And every time you take a bit of time out of your day, your very busy days, to engage in this work, you're making us one step closer to a better place. So thank you all very much. I believe Megan will show the survey, should automatically show up on your screen. And that's it. Have a wonderful, wonderful day and keep doing the good work.
Great seeing you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day.